Welcome to Kent ISD Literacy Leaders and Coaches Network Remote Edition. We are excited to bring you our 19th episode of the LLCN Brief. We appreciate those that are now following us on your preferred podcast outlet and excited to share that we now have about 5,100 plus unique listens to our previous 18 podcast episodes. These listens come from 43 different countries and 47 different states. We appreciate that you are finding value in the information we are making available for you. Thank you for continuing to share our message with those that you know will benefit from listening.
Our guest today is no stranger to Kent County. We have long admired her work and have used one of her previously published books as an anchor for our Ignite Engagement professional learning cohort for numerous years. This episode will provide opportunities to revisit the idea of student engagement on a different level and reflect upon and re-examine our beliefs about engaging students. I'm Sarah Shoemaker, early literacy coach.
And I'm Mark Raffler, English Language Arts Consultant, Kent ISD. The idea of student engagement has long been a part of Kent ISD professional learning offerings. We have looked at engagement in elementary and secondary level buildings. We have looked at engagement from the lens of behavior, as well as are the students participating and are they actively thirsting for more knowledge. We have surveyed students across the county, checking in to see if they are engaged in the learning and feel seen in our schools. Our opportunity for learning about engagement expands today as we dive into a deeper conversation on the topic and how we continue to strive to get all kids engaged in their learning environments.
One of Kent ISD's favorite engagement gurus, Ellin Keene, has agreed to join us for an upcoming winter book study entitled Engaging Children, Igniting a Drive for Deeper Learning as another way to support the efforts of educators in engaging students in the classroom. In her book, Engaging Children, Ellin addresses the importance of defining and understanding engagement through the 4 pillars of engagement: intellectual urgency, emotional resonance, perspective bending, and the aesthetic world. Exploring these concepts of engagement has led Kent ISD to define 5 engagement accelerators. I'll let our guests today explain more.
I'm excited to be partnering in this podcast recording with my colleague, Bridget Rieth. Bridget, would you please introduce yourself to the group?
Hi, I'm Bridget Rieth, an early literacy coach and Ignite Engagement Coordinator at Kent ISD. I have had the privilege to work alongside today's guest in student engagement focused initiatives since 2019. Ellin Oliver Keene has been a teacher, staff developer, nonprofit director, and adjunct professor of reading and writing. For 16 years, she directed staff development initiatives at the Denver-based Public Education and Business Coalition, where she now serves in a research and development role. She served as Deputy Director and Director of Literacy and Staff Development for the Cornerstone Project at the University of Pennsylvania for 4 years. Ellin works closely with schools and districts throughout the country and abroad. Her emphasis is long-term, school-based professional development and strategic planning for literacy learning. Ellin has published 6 solo books, including Engaging Children, Igniting a Drive for Deeper Learning, The Literacy Studio, and To Understand. She is co-author of Comprehension Going Forward and the foundational reading comprehension text, Mosaic of Thought. Ellin is co-author and co-editor of The Teacher You Want to Be, and co-editor with Nell Duke of the Not This But That series. She has also written numerous contributions for professional books and journals on the teaching of reading and education policy. In my classroom teaching experience, I had the unique pleasure to learn from this powerhouse and have served alongside her in leading Ignite engagement cohorts at Kent ISD. I am so happy to introduce to all of you, Ellin Keene. Ellin, why is student engagement so critical?
Well, Bridget, first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me to have this conversation today. I think your first question is extremely relevant, perhaps now more than ever in education in this country, for a number of reasons beyond educators' control, including a pandemic. We have a growing number of students that either appear to be or are disengaged. And the sort of maxim that I try to keep in mind is that if kids aren't engaged, they don't retain and reapply what they learn. Obviously, our intent and purpose and mission in teaching and learning is for kids to retain and reapply, especially reapply what they learn. If they're not engaged, that process is disrupted, and sometimes to a critical degree. So I remember, as you probably do, Bridget, asking my students at the beginning of every year, "Oh, you guys remember that? You learned that last year." And they would say, "No, no, don't remember. Can't, never learned it." That became very frustrating to me over the years, and I decided to dig into this topic. I think one of the things that worries me a little bit is that I hear educators decrying the lack of engagement, talking about how kids aren't engaged and really frustrated about what to do about it. But we rarely teach children how to be engaged. And nor do we very often discuss engagement directly in our classrooms. We talk about the lack of it, but we don't teach them how. And from my work in literacy over the last many, many years, what I've understood is that children need to be metacognitive about their learning strategies. That's what we wrote about in Mosaic of Thought. They need to be aware of what they're thinking about as they read and write. We've known that in the research for decades and decades. What we haven't thought about, I think, in many cases, is that we want kids to be aware of their own engagement or lack thereof and to be able to take action, right? So I think we have seen teachers as sort of the promoter, the motivator, the inspiration, sort of magic show, and trying to keep kids interested and engaged. And I think that is not probably the best way to do it. In the end, kids need to be responsible for their own engagement. They need to be able to understand when they are disengaged and what to do to become re-engaged in a very real way. Bridget, as you know from your classroom, that doesn't happen very often. And if we can't model for students and talk about student engagement in whole group, small group, conferences, we're not going to see the level of ownership for their own engagement that we know kids can have. And that's sort of the goal of the book, Engaging Children, is to say, how can we talk both spontaneously and in a planned way about student engagement with the kids and talk and model what it's like to be engaged in our own stories we tell children about our lives as curious, interested people in the world. We're modeling for them, or we need to be modeling for them, exactly what it feels like, smells like, tastes like to be engaged. So that is a response to why this is so critical, Bridget. It goes right to, do kids learn? Do they retain and reapply or not? And if we're worried about kids retaining and reapplying, we have to talk about engagement very directly and model it very frequently.
So effective teaching and learning have always sat firmly upon the existence of student engagement. And we are at a time when it's as critical as ever in this post-COVID world that we be able to push in and impact not only student engagement as a whole, but helping children see what that engagement is about and how to learn about it, to affect it, to put the power in their hands.
Correct. I think engagement doesn't show up in state standards documents. You're lucky in Michigan that it shows up front and center, as a matter of fact, the first of the essentials that your state has put together, which I've told you many times I think is an absolutely superb document. But in most states, that's not the case. In most states, it just doesn't show up in anything that teachers are formally charged with teaching. And if they're given resources and having to follow a script, engagement is never going to come up on through those materials. We have to take that on.
The responsibility often falls upon the classroom teacher to be impacting that, but we also want to be thinking about what ways can systems support that work.
Absolutely. Yep.
I appreciate, Ellen, you really hitting on the idea of that it's not just about the teacher, and you use that term of the magic show. So, moving toward the students themselves, can you tell us about types of the student-centered practices that are going to lead to a higher level of engagement in the classroom?
Yeah, Mark, thank you. We have known through very, very intensive, both qualitative and quantitative research for decades that a student centered classroom, and we can talk about what that means, but a student centered classroom yields better results in terms of children retaining and reapplying what they know. So, under that umbrella, a student centered classroom, one of the key factors is that students have ownership. They have choice. I could have had, Mark, a much shorter book if I had just written choice equals engagement, but it's somewhat more complicated than that, but not really. It is, student choice is absolutely critical. And student choice obviously is a hallmark of a student centered classroom. Student choice is absolutely critical to their engagement. I would even go so far as to say if kids don't have choice in their day throughout their day, we can count on them not remembering and not reapplying what they're taught. So this is a very critical issue, and I worry a little bit as teachers are required to teach very closely to a script that those scripts very rarely take into account student choice and ownership. So there's a real tension point right now in terms of what's happening in this country. But it was the positive side of it, the upside of it is that when I was researching this book, and again, it went back to a question in my own teaching, like, why don't they retain and reapply? And what more can I do to motivate them? Well, motivation is something that we do to kids. Engagement is something that they own and work on and develop and reconnect themselves. That's the kind of choice that I'm referring to in a student centered classroom. I watched kids for about 2.5 years in their classrooms all over the country and just watched and just took notes and just waited. And what happened in that, I was looking specifically at who is engaged, who's not, who appears to be engaged, who doesn't appear to be engaged, but really are. So that there's just this picture of kids. And I think a lot of us, myself included, at one point felt like, okay, if they're sitting up, they're looking at me, their little hands are folded in their laps, they're engaged. And that could not be further from the truth. Certainly some kids look engaged when they are engaged, but many don't. And I had that experience in my own classroom, and I've seen it dozens of times. So what I was really trying to get at in this book is, how do we really know if kids are engaged or not? Because nonverbals are not always going to do the trick. Hands raised and questions asked are not always going to reflect true engagement that, again, is owned by the student and not up to us to, do the magic show, as I mentioned before. In those observations, I discovered 4 patterns of engagement that just kept coming up over and over and over, that when I debriefed children or interviewed kids after observing, and I had my own belief, this child was engaged, this child wasn't, I would find that I was often wrong. And what they were saying to me um, really fell into these patterns, and I call them pillars in the book, 4 pillars of engagement. The first 2 won't surprise you at all. The first one is I refer to as intellectual urgency, which is that kid that we all just love so much, or kids that we love so much, who is just so excited about learning something, and how can I find out more, and where do I go to understand this, and have you heard about this? And there are the kids who come in the first thing in the morning and regale you. I had one kiddo, fourth grader, who would come in every morning and talk about what he had learned overnight about space. So he wanted to talk about space for a long time, and I'm trying to get the lunch count, and I'm trying to do all the things, and I've got 50 other kids, not really, 20 other kids, you know, metaphorically tugging on my sleeve. And here was Robert wanting to talk about space. And he was just rabid. He was on fire. I could not get him materials fast enough. That's intellectual urgency. We all experience it. We all have an intellectual urgency about particular things in our lives. Bridget will tell you that I regularly bore my friends to tears talking about commercial aviation. I am a fan of flying. I can never get enough. I can never learn enough. Bridget and I have a mutual friend who's a captain for a major airline, and I pepper her every week with questions very much like my kid did coming in to tell me about space. So I am now driving her crazy. I'm kind of paying it forward, the craziness of Robert talking to me about space, she's now experiencing with all my questions. That's intellectual urgency. We need to know more. We can't get enough. The second pillar I refer to as emotional resonance. Again, not a surprise to your listeners, Mark and Bridget. It's emotional resonance is when we have that deep emotional response, anything on the range, the spectrum of emotional moments in our children's lives. It's the time when a child, I had one day before yesterday in West Michigan, actually, who I was reading a very powerful book, and he had a very strong connection. The book was really about bullying at its base. And he had a very, very strong emotional connection. And just when they went to write about the book, just was, again, just passionate about getting his thoughts down. Maybe other kids had that same response. I'm not sure, but his was so visible and audible. He cried in the group. As much as I don't want to have kids crying, I know that he's in a super safe space to do that, and that I was going to give him all the support he needed. His teacher was going to give him all the support he needed. There were 10 observing teachers in the room. I mean, he was really in a safe space. That was triggered by a book. And I'm not saying that the emotional reaction always needs to be sadness or, profound in any way. It's any kind of emotional response. It's joy. It's reading Owl Moon to kids and having kids relate times that they, have been in nature at night, those kinds of things. Just, that's an emotional experience. So the other two patterns that I saw, honestly, were a big surprise to me. The next one I call the aesthetic world. Aesthetic, traditionally referring to beauty. What I discovered is that kids became intellectually urgent and emotionally connected when they found something from their perspective that was beautiful. Now, you and Bridget and I think about, beauty of, listening to a concert, or standing on a mountaintop, or standing on the banks of Lake Michigan and looking out across the water. That's how we see beauty. Kids don't always see it that way. For example, when kids read books that are hilarious and they can't stop laughing and they want to read it over and over and over again, that's their aesthetic. That's what they find beautiful or compelling or exciting. So they have, what I learned in this research was that kids have a very strong sense of the aesthetic, and we need to find out what it is, because we need to direct resources and materials and encouragement their direction. Because again, if you're engaged aesthetically, in this case, you're going to retain and reapply much longer. And the fourth one is I've called perspective bending, which is something that Bridget and I have been privileged to observe in schools. I'm thinking of one class in East Grand Rapids, Bridget, where I was reading a nonfiction text called Apes, and I read a little section to third graders about bonobos, which I also happen to be very passionate about. Bonobos and airplanes doesn't really go together, but there you are. We had the kids who were just very passionate about how the bonobo's habitat is leading to their extinction. And they were very, very on fire about that until I mentioned that because of my research on bonobos, I'm aware that in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the government, because bonobo tourism is very popular, the Congolese government has taken eminent domain over ranches and farms that have been there for generations, not providing the sort of support for farmers and ranchers who are actually taken out of their land. So there's no retraining for new jobs and so on. So that puts a slightly different perspective on what's happening to the people as we're exercising eminent domain over their land. And kids, third graders, it was no problem. Bridget, I don't know remember if you were in that room at that time, but we could not stop them talking about it. And the idea, I think, Mark and Bridget, is that conflict itself is engaging. Sometimes that's a little tough to hear. It's a little, but when we're working with kids to write stories, we have characters, of course, we have setting, but we must have conflict. Conflict is the touchstone for engagement. So in these cases, when I'm honestly purposefully starting an argument, they are deeply engaged. They cannot be stopped. Recess, lunch, doesn't matter. They want to keep talking. So those four pillars were really the patterns that I observed in watching children over about 2.5 years. So the idea really is to talk, when I'm saying talk about engagement, we do it in the structure sometimes of those four pillars. Oh my gosh, Bridget, I noticed that you were really intellectually urgent about that topic. So we're literally naming the types of engagement as we see them emerge in the classroom, and we always see them emerge in the classroom.
I actually had the opportunity to sit in on a couple of the times that you presented to the
Oh,
groups of
really?
teachers. So yeah,
Sorry, I
absolutely.
didn't remember. Oh,
No worries. What you brought up here that really stood out to me is the idea of engagement and you connecting that to motivation. I think sometimes that, speaking of perspective bending, maybe in a different way than
yeah,
Tom would, but
yeah,
it makes
yeah,
people see
yeah.
differently that engagement isn't about, as you shared some of those engagement pieces, but students being motivated. But then also, it's not really about them motivating them per se, or it is, but how to evaluate if they are motivated or engaged, as you put it.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Now,
and
motivation can lead to engagement, but motivation is, we think about motivating someone, it's us doing it to them.
as you shared through the four pillars again, the one that I remember now, and your example brought me back to it, was the beauty or the compelling piece. Being the literacy consultant, what I was really immersed in was a lot of the Common Core shifts as they were, right? So more boring than what we're talking about here today with your amazing book, of course, but the idea of text complexity. And so
Yeah,
what it really struck me was, obviously there's the quantitative and the qualitative, but there's that third
precisely.
element of reader task match. And so I feel like it really matches up well there too. I just made that connection again, which reminded me like, oh yeah. No, I appreciate hitting those different pieces and pulling those out and explaining those. And I think we all, as we're listening, can reflect on how we've probably seen that in our students, although we may not have had these words for them and what that looks like.
Exactly, Mark. Yeah, well said. And I think it is, what's fun is that once they know the language, they start using it. And Bridget, I think you've probably seen that in your classroom where someone will say, "Oh, that's really emotional to them," or "Oh, you bent my perspective," just like you just said, Mark. And so then they have a shared language for engagement, which again helps us move from solely motivation to true engagement.
Ellen, we had the opportunity to see that so frequently as we worked together over the years with the same teachers and kids as they moved through grades. And I think that it's gratifying every single time. But I have to say, when you see, a first or a second grader popping up and saying,
Absolutely.
that bends my
Yeah,
perspective, or
yeah.
that's an
It's an
aesthetic
aesthetic
experience. Oh,
experience. Yeah.
that's a
No,
very
it's
enjoyable moment.
unfortunate. Yeah. It's
Yes.
beautiful. And unfortunately for kinders and first graders, they don't have any teeth. So saying aesthetic is a bit tricky. And we usually get some showered when they try to say aesthetic without any teeth. But it's amazing. And then the idea, of course, is that if that language is embedded early on, kinder, first, second, that it will really grow, and older kids throughout their time in a school will really be able to work with those again with a lot of their own ownership and really driving it for themselves.
Ellen, within talking about the four pillars of engagement and describing how you were observing those, you mentioned a few look fors. What other kinds of data and evidence can we collect as we go along to see if we have students who are engaged and where it's falling in and where it's falling out? What
Yeah.
can we use to measure that?
Such a great question. And I think teachers, classroom teachers, will be perhaps happy to hear that you can't test engagement on any form of criterion referenced or norm referenced instrument. They simply cannot do that. So the assessment, Bridget, is really through teacher observation. But more than that, it's conversation with kids. Once we begin these conversations and we're talking about, let's say, intellectual urgency, if I'm working with a small group of kids and I'm concerned about, I'm not sure whether they're engaged or not, I can bring that language that we've discussed many times and that ideally I've already modeled into the conversation. They have to tell us if ultimately. But because we haven't spent a lot of time or any time teaching kids about what engagement is, it's going to take a while. They have to learn to recognize it in themselves. They have to be metacognitive about it, just like they would be with reading strategies. The idea is to get kids to a place where they're conversant enough in their own understanding of their engagement to be able to interact with us, to tell us whether or not, and to talk about how to get re-engaged. There are a couple of instruments that I've designed that are in the book that relate to sort of a more structured observation for teachers, the kind of record that you could step back, take 5 minutes, look at a couple of kids about whom you may be concerned or you're not sure if they're engaged, and there's a little checklist that focuses on the four pillars. And so that's a little bit more formal way. Honestly, I think observation is the key here. But there's another piece, and that is that students need to be measuring their own engagement. Again, it's their responsibility, it's their opportunity to love learning. You don't love learning if it's being jammed down your throat, if you don't have any choice in the matter. There's also a form that I ask kids to keep track of their own engagement. And that helps sometimes too. But the conversations that I'm talking about, talking with kids about what it feels like to be engaged, why it's important, how it continues to prod me in my intellectual development as an old lady, right? And it is those conversations. It's not a lesson. It doesn't take very long. Bridget, you know this from your own classroom. It doesn't take 40 minutes. It can take 4 minutes for that matter to just remember to bring the conversation about engagement to the forefront so that we can talk about it. And if they can talk about it, we can assess it, small a. We can assess it, and perhaps in the most powerful way, which is in discourse with kids.
So we're really talking about a qualitative approach to gathering information about what's happening in that classroom. And Ellen, I hear you saying that the teaching of that common language becomes even more important because in order to not only give students that ownership, but for the teacher to be able to get a peek inside at what's happening,
Mhm.
students need to be able to use similar language that you are using. And then, of course, we know that qualitative data can also be written down. If you need
For sure.
records to follow, that those are ways that those are things that can be recorded.
Exactly. And our colleague Diane Teich, who was the founder of the Ignite engagement program in West Michigan, has taken the each of the pillars and the sort of larger notion of a student-centered classroom and developed a rubric around those difficult to measure things. And it's extremely helpful. And I think it lives at Kent ISD so that people can perhaps have access to it. But what she has done is to try to define and describe things that we can't see or hear. The type of student centered classroom that has the tone and culture that we're talking about, the degree to which we can really look thoughtfully and intentionally at children's engagement. So a lot of that work has been done. I worked with her, I advised her on it, but she wrote that, and it was just terrific.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you, Ellen. Some of these pieces are something that we can absolutely provide in the resources with the show notes for people to take a look at. So thank you.
Terrific. Yeah.
And talking about data, that obviously brings us to other components and things that we're up against. But considering that districts have these required instructional materials and standards that they're adhering to, how can educators prioritize student engagement across all grades and disciplines?
Such an important question and so relevant in 2025 and beyond. Lots of teachers are struggling with that. I'll go back to something I said right from the beginning, which is that if students aren't engaged, they won't retain and reapply, or are very unlikely to. We've got actual numbers on that. Between 15 and 20% of kids will, if not engaged, will carry learning forward into across several intervals, a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months. It's just the statistics around that are shocking. When kids are in texts, for example, that they're not interested in, they are being sort of forced to read, we can expect that they won't retain and reapply as well. And it's not their fault, right? We may have to use those in some cases. We just need to acknowledge that they're not going to retain and reapply what you're teaching nearly as well as if they are actually excited about the text. I've had lots of conversations with teachers around graphic novels. And when I left the classroom, graphic novels were, nascent. It was just coming out, and I sort of looked down my nose at graphic novels. What I realize now is that kids engage right away in many of those graphic novels. Some are of higher quality than others, but that choice that they have to go into something they know they're going to love and aesthetically respond to, as in laughing out loud in some cases. I mean, think Dog Man. It's a very powerful tool of engagement. So what I would say, Mark, is that given what we must do, we really need to think about supplementing it with what will engage them. And I think, honestly, I think we have to acknowledge, yeah, this is not my favorite story either. Yeah, this one, it reminds me of this book, but I don't like it quite as well. I mean, I'm talking about being honest with kids and acknowledging that it is tougher to engage in some circumstances, but that together we're working on something, learning something, a standard that's very, very important to us, and we gotta push through this. And guess what? At the other end, you've got Dogman to read. The standards don't change. Our focus on standards does not change. There are certainly standards that have much more research base behind them than others, but generally speaking, they are based in solid research. But if teachers stay focused on those state standards, wherever they are, and they know that that is job one, to get those standards taught, to be honest, there are no resources or materials that are going to identically line up with the standards. They're just not. So by definition, if we're going to meet those standards, we're going to be off script for certain portions of the year. So I think it's standards we can't change, we don't want to change, but the resources and materials, I think teachers are tremendous critical thinkers, honestly. They know you look at a lesson spread out over a week in a particular resource, you know which ones are going to resonate with your kids and which ones aren't immediately. And I think we have to trust ourselves and listen to that critical thought. Yeah, this one is going to be more resonant for our kids, and it's an important contribution to our learning of the standard. That is, we've got to be a little discerning, and we cannot be afraid to leave lessons out. And I know that's a very controversial statement. And particularly when the resources are brand new and everybody's saying you must use this with fidelity. The fidelity isn't to the materials, the fidelity is to the standard. And that's job one. We are legally bound to do that. That is picking and choosing pieces from the resource that are terrific. They all have pieces that are very usable and helpful. And there's a lot that isn't. And if we see our kids struggling with that, I'll give you an example, and that is the graphic organizers that come in many of the materials we use with kids, and having to fill out a graphic organizer every day or every other day that we're reading. You get very sick of those graphic organizers very quickly. And if you're doing them for the entire school year, and then again next year and the year after and the year after, we're going to lose kids in droves. I think some of the things that we can push back from or is actually removing some of the tasks that we ask kids to do. Graphic organizers can be very helpful for some kids in some circumstances, for all kids in a very few circumstances. I think we have to be willing to walk away from some of those requirements. And I say requirements, I yet have not found a district that says you have to do every task on every page of this resource. I think sometimes we interpret it that way, particularly early career people who are not on terrifically solid ground yet. Remember when you were a first year teacher? I do, and I don't know where my kids are now. I hope they can read. But the issue really is to have the confidence to say, that's not going to work for my kids. Any publisher cannot know your kids. You know your kids. You got to trust that instinct. You've got to say, you know what? I'm going to do this and this, but not that and not that.
I appreciate your distilling with that term fidelity, being fidelity to the standard and what's in the skills and the nouns, which is the boring part of it to say, but that's what we're bringing to students versus the materials. And you are correct. When I happen to have a lot of conversations with districts around selection of materials, and we do talk about that, there are not any that match to that level because, I mean, let's be honest, if there were, we wouldn't be having selection process, right? We would already know what we would be using.
Yeah.
And it really just dovetails back into, obviously we know that the skills and those things are important, but then how we're seeing our students take ownership or then demonstrate those skills and then adjustments that we might need to make, whether it be a different graphic organizer or less of a graphic organizer or a different portion of, or whatever it may be, that makes a lot of sense. And
Yeah. If you know your kids and you know the standards, you as a teacher use the artistry that is the reason you went into teaching in the first place to get those kids to those standards. That's job one. I think the other tricky part that I want to respond to your statement, Mark, is that not all skills in our adopted materials are helpful for kids. There is stuff in there that somebody said, oh, well, if we're going to sell this product in Arizona, we better put this in, that actually don't have any research behind them. So it's very, very difficult, I think, for teachers to know when everything is presented, as if they're all equally important. They're absolutely not. There are some that are more important, less important, and there are some that need to be taken out of the scope and sequence. I always get nervous when I hear that term because they have no research behind them at all. One example that I can give you of that is the notion of main idea. So if there's any concept that we teach in, well, K-12 really, as more than main idea, it becomes theme at a certain point. I don't know what's more important than that, right? Or what's taught more often. Main idea is not supported by any research. None. Main idea emerged in the early 20th century because it was used for testing. The Stanford Binet organization out of Stanford, obviously, developed this notion of testing kids' reading skill by asking them what the main idea of a passage was. Well, I would defy either of you or me to describe one main idea in any piece that we read. There simply isn't. There are a number of important ideas, but we really cause kids to think convergently, not in an imaginative way, not divergently, when we're pretending, when we're telling them there's one main idea. There simply is not. Now, I do, and I did in my own classroom, absolutely prepare my kids for the assessments and the fact that they were going to be asked about main idea. But I did not, and especially since I've left the classroom, you don't drill into main idea for 6 months of the year. It just doesn't have any support. And I can bet you that no matter what series or resource you're using, main idea is all over it, and it's in the standards. It's a really quick adjustment, to use your word, Mark, to say to talk about important ideas, not main idea. So that's just an example that we all assume that everything in these scopes and sequences are of equal importance. We all assume that there is an order in which we should teach those skills, neither of which is true beyond phonics instruction. There is no sequence in literacy learning after kids are using phonics ably, right?
Perfect. Thank you. Yes. Well, and I appreciate also how you're speaking to it quite succinctly and yet in a way that makes sense to carry forward. Because I agree with the idea that main idea, anyway, when we teach main idea, we teach about the skills that it takes to get to that point to make the best determination of which is the best fit. So I appreciate that.
As our listeners look to learn more about what true engagement is and how to integrate this type of work into their practices, what additional resources might you recommend that our listeners look at, Ellen? Of course, they're going to want to look at your book, Engaging Children, which I highly recommend as foundational to this thinking. What other directions might you point them in?
Thank you, Bridget. There are certainly a lot of resources about how to motivate children. As a teacher, I consumed them all. I remember one that was like 101 ways to motivate your students. And I pretty much just did one every day, which is super ridiculous, right? I didn't contextualize it all. So I would say, first, let's avoid those motivation in a can kinds of resources. But I think there are a couple of things that I will say. Matt Glover and Carl Anderson are currently working on a book about engaged writing, and I cannot wait for that. They are Heinemann authors, and it will be published by Heinemann, but it will also have materials and resources, consumables that are actually really good. They're not worksheets, they're amazing. And I've had a chance to look at those, and I just can't wait till this book comes out. It is not yet titled, so I would share that if I can, but watch for Matt Glover, who you've read before in his work in early literacy, and Carl Anderson, whose superb work in conferring with children, especially around writing, just is unbeatable. I would suggest that. The other suggestion that may sound a little strange is that we look outside of education. I was looking for research on education, and certainly John Guthrie has done a great deal of research in engagement motivation, but it's written as research, right? It is not as reader friendly for many of us as we would like it to be, but that's the research. That's where the research largely lives, is John Guthrie's work, Motivation and Engagement. But I would actually look outside education. When I was writing this book, I read books about the business world, which I have no experience in at all, except as a teenager selling skis in my little hometown. But the business world has studied engagement and motivation in great depth. Some of it is completely irrelevant to us, but there's a lot in there that is relevant to us. For example, the difference between motivation, us doing something to them, and engagement really comes from research that I read, or books that I read in business. So I hadn't differentiated at all between motivation and engagement. That, and it's cited in the book, that was really a perspective bending for me. I just hadn't used motivation engagement synonymously. I've also looked in some work that's been written for artists, musicians, visual artists, just any and every kind of artist. And primarily that work is their own writing. And writers, by the way, are part of that group. An artist writes about how they get excited about doing the work, and it doesn't automatically come as we might imagine. Oh, the artist is inspired, she sits down with the easel, and it's all, they have to motivate themselves to a degree that I find just astonishing. As a writer, I of course just write nonfiction for teachers, but as a writer, I will tell you, even if I'm burning to write a book, I have a hard time getting myself engaged in it sometimes. I will do anything. I will, scrub the floors before I sit down sometimes. And so this is a very real issue in professional areas outside of education. And I encourage people to look at it. Malcolm Gladwell, of course, has written extensively about this. The term bliss and all of the writing that's been done about bliss really takes on engagement and motivation. And I have several other sources that I cite, which don't come to mind immediately, but they're out there.
Thank you, Ellen. We appreciate you pushing our thinking, not just within the research around education, but out and beyond, because we know engagement lives everywhere.
If you're human, you're dealing with it, right? I would argue that my basset hounds are also dealing with it, but just maybe not as eloquently.
All right, Ellen, we've asked some questions and appreciate all the expertise that you have offered. As we conclude this interview, what have we not asked that is important to highlight here?
Oh, thanks, Mark. I really actually like that question. I think I've covered a lot of territory, and of course, I would want your listeners to have access to my contact information, because once you start to put things like this into play, there are a lot of questions that come up. My website is www.mosaicliteracy.com, and I would encourage anyone to communicate with questions through that. And my email is ellen@mosaicliteracy.com. But just as a kind of, tidying up at the end, I just cannot overemphasize the need to talk with children about engagement. If it's 2 minutes, great. If it's 2 minutes once a week, that's better than what we were doing when we don't talk to kids about engagement. The idea of introducing the terminology, intellectual urgency, emotional resonance, and so on is important for sure. And I think the most important thing is to have those conversations. Whole group, small group, individual conferences, it doesn't matter, but to get kids conversant in their own power to wield engagement as one of their learning tools is a very potent tool for them. So I guess the sort of counterpoint to that is that means we've got to listen. So the adults in the room, we have to listen so carefully to children, and not, it's so hard not to rush them when we have so many things to talk about and so much on our plates, but to really listen and talk to a kiddo who, like my little guy on Tuesday in West Michigan, needed to be heard. And, fortunately, we were able to meet that need. But that listening is what's going to tell us whether, back to Bridget's question about assessment, that's really going to be our best tool. I also try to buy myself 2, 3, 4 minutes. Bridget, you've seen me do this in classrooms where I just stand back. I do not let anyone interrupt me unless I always tell them, unless Beyonce walks through the door, do not interrupt me. I'm watching the children. If Beyonce walks in the door, hey, I think we should greet her. Short of that, nothing to interrupt me. And the idea that I can stand back and just move around the room a little bit, look at the kids from different angles, who's doing what, who looks engaged, who may not be engaged, who doesn't look engaged, but maybe. We've got to sort of, perfect that process. So everything that I've talked about here today is in 2 or 3 minute intervals. This is not a new curriculum. This is not a new standard. It is beautifully articulated in your literacy essentials. And so I would encourage you to look back at that. I think it's essential number 1. Bridget will correct me if I'm wrong. It is. I think that essential is based on the research in this area, and is incredibly important that you have that. So if you're worried about taking a couple minutes out to observe, understand that what you're doing is building essential number 1. That's part of how we build a student-centered classroom, how we meet those essentials, because they are, again, deeply imbued in the research or with research. Don't feel guilty about doing that. If somebody's nose starts bleeding, say, I'll look forward to seeing how you solve that problem. I'm watching the readers and writers here. I think we sometimes feel guilty if we're not teaching, moving constantly. Our best assessment in the world is standing back to watch children.
Well, thank you, Ellen. Thank you for the interview today. You've made yourself very available to the teachers here in West Michigan, especially here in Kent
Absolutely.
County. And I know they really appreciate that. So you additionally sharing some of these other contact points was great. And then I think it's always a good idea to talk about what are things that might get them moving, because as they might be moved again or reinvigorated or continued on with the passion that they're already from the work that you've brought here to the county. Again, the reminder, starting little to go big, right? Even if it's a few minutes or it's one last
Exactly.
just take that time and make it available. And as always, we really work hard as a literacy team to make connections to the essentials. You did that for us. So again, it's a pleasure. We've appreciated how you've pulled some of these pieces together and just really hit on
You
the high
bet.
work that you've been doing for us. So thank you.
Well, gorgeous opportunity to work with both of you. Bridget already knows that I adore working with her, but now it's both of you. So you may have to, get rid of me some way. But it's been a pleasure to go back and revisit these ideas that mean so much to me. And I really believe will mean a lot to your kids.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Ellen. Thank you so much. It's nothing but a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this LLCN Brief podcast today. We appreciate our guest, Ellin Keene. Thank you for sharing your years of educational insight relating to student engagement. If you're looking to access the resources from today's podcast episode, please visit our electronic document, LLCN 2526 resources at bit.ly/L, C, N, lowercase resources 2526.
We look forward to connecting with you again in the near future. Also, we're looking for your suggestions on topics as well as questions you may have related to literacy. Please take the time to let us know what you want to learn more about through the Google form, bit.ly, and that's bit.ly/L, C, N, all lowercase topics.
You can earn sketch credit by listening to the LLCN Brief podcast. Podcast PDX is bite-sized learning that allows you to earn sketch credit for doing something you already love, listening to the LLCN Brief podcast.
We know you are busy. This professional learning opportunity will meet you where you are, anytime, anywhere. You can earn up to 1.25 sketch credits per episode by listening and briefly reflecting. We have made it easy to earn your credits. Just visit our podcast PDX homepage, This can be found at bit.ly, that's bit.ly / all lowercase podcast, capital P, capital D, lowercase x. At this homepage, you'll find 3 easy steps that you can take to get you on the road to earning sketch credit while listening to your favorite literacy podcast. Thank you for listening today.